Hi everyone! Thank you for taking time to be with us today. We have created this presentation for a general audience and so have distilled the main findings from a very complex report into language that is easily accessible for everyone. Our goal is that at the end of this presentation, you will be able to answer a very simple question. Are we happier post-pandemic? Spoiler alert, the answer may not be what you expect, so stay tuned. As this is an information presentation, there are no key decisions to be made, but our secondary goal, or what success would look like for us, is if by listening to this presentation, you are challenged to think about your own happiness and what factors drive it. And with that, let's get started. Unless you were born yesterday, you are one of 7 billion people that was likely confined to an apartment or some other dwelling place because of the infamous COVID-19 pandemic. If you recall, we saw the best and worst of humanity in full display, from disputes regarding the safety and efficacy of masks, to multiple theories about the origin of the virus, to even hate towards specific demographics. With all the confusion that we saw with the pandemic, it's natural to start asking questions like, where does the freedom to make life choices start and end? Is the government corrupt? Is money or social support more important? And ultimately, how are we as a society? Are we happy? This incredible team of 6 analysts were also curious, and so we set out to answer some of these questions using data provided by the Happiness Report. The Happiness Report sent out surveys to respondents from across the world to ultimately answer 2 questions. 1, as a society, are we happy? And 2, what are the factors that most contribute to a person's perceived happiness? These researchers have conducted this survey every year for the past 7 years and have identified 6 factors that have a causal relationship with a person's perceived happiness. These factors are GDP per capita, social support, freedom to make life choices, perceived corruption in government, and generosity. In this presentation, we're going to explore 2 main themes. 1, are we happier or sadder post-pandemic? Post-pandemic is defined as years between 2019 and 2022. And 2, are there factors that are associated with happier continents? And if so, are those factors consistent across continents? And with that, let's dive into the data.
Starting with the first question, are we happier post-pandemic? The answer is it depends. From 2015 to 2022, we found that happiness has been increasing over time. And interestingly, the pandemic didn't seem to affect happiness. In fact, data shows that our happiness rose by about 4% post-pandemic, which might make some of you suspicious. Because if you lived through the world shutting down and not being able to live life as a normal, it makes sense that happiness must have been affected, right? That's right. As it turns out, the reason for the positive happiness growth is because continents like Europe and Africa experienced over 7% increase in happiness in post-pandemic years, whereas America saw a decrease.
So, what's going on? To understand better, let's start with deeper at a subcontinent level. Let's kickstart with Africa. As we know that Africa's happiness score is increased if you remember our last slides. And the main contributor to boost the African score is the Middle Africa and the Western Africa. The happiness score is increased about 14%. Which factors made the difference? Let's start with the generosity. In African culture, there are large emphasis placed on giving to the others because social relationship and being community oriented are highly valued. But post-pandemic data shows 10% drop in the generosity. Surprise? We are too. The pandemic caused economic disruption, leading to the jobless and the reduction in the income, making people harder to become more generous. So obvious. Also, social distancing and this isolation made it difficult to engage the act of generosity and community support as people had to scale back and suspend the activities due to the restrictions. Regardless, we also found that the Western and the Middle African countries are comparatively more generous in the post-pandemic year than that of the Southern Africa. Southern Africa is the less generous and the least happier.
The second important factor for Africa's happiness was life expectancy. We see that Middle and Western African countries had better life expectancy, whereas Southern African countries had the worst life expectancy in post-pandemic years. Things get interesting when we look at social support. While increased happiness is usually linked to having higher levels of social support, which means people feel like they have someone to rely on in times of trouble, the happiest subregions in Africa, Western and Middle, reported the least levels of social support, whereas Southern Africa, the country with the least increase of happiness scores, had the highest level of social support. So what does this all mean? As we've mentioned before, Africa had a 7% increase in post-pandemic happiness. This is mainly because the Middle and Western regions, which hold the highest generosity and life expectancy scores, despite having a lower level of social support.
Talking about Europe, there was a rise in numbers in all subregions, but it was particularly notable in the southern part, where there was an increase of 10%. This is the reason for the significant overall percentage increase that we observe for the European continent. And which factors made the difference in this case? This was made possible thanks to the social support. In fact, speaking from my personal experience, I can say that people from the Southern Europe are much more prone to interpersonal relationship compared to people in the northern countries, for example, who are much more sedentary and solitary. Furthermore, some southern countries also had less restrictive COVID laws. For example, Portugal, at the end of the pandemic, had less restrictive rules regarding the times when people were allowed to leave their homes and travel, and this greatly affected people's happiness, young people especially.
The second defining factor for Southern Europe was life expectancy. Overall, life expectancy for Europe has decreased by 5% since the start of pandemic. Given the sharp decline, we observe this graph coincides with the start of COVID-19. We think that the decrease is likely a result of how pandemic affected lives and healthcare systems in Europe. However, Southern European countries had better life expectancy compared to other European regions. This can be attributed to combination of factors including a healthier diet, active lifestyle, more accessible and less stressed healthcare system, and even a favorable climate. Last important factor is the freedom to make life choices. Southern European countries reported the highest feeling of autonomy in post-pandemic years. This is likely that a mixture of cultural norms, strong relationships, and an effective government resulted in these countries feeling more empowered and having more autonomy during the post-pandemic period. What does this mean to Europe? While we are not drawing a causal link, our analysis of happiest subregions in Europe compared to other subregions suggests that increase in social support, life expectancy, and autonomy could contribute to increased happiness in Europe.
In conclusion, are we happier? The answer is, it depends on where you live. We see that happiness has been on the rise globally and was overall not affected by the pandemic. European and African countries contributed the most to the rise in happiness, as in Africa, generosity and life expectancy were deemed the most important, while in Europe, social support, life expectancy, and the freedom of choice were deemed the most important. From our data, we gathered that life expectancy was the most important common denominator contributing to happiness overall.